I think our friend John Hurt, the historian, is going to speak today on the Spanish flu. And, that'll give us an idea about it. You say?
Hey, Nick.
Yeah. I can't hear John.
Tell everybody that a notification about, pardon? Can
What?
I just say that I sent out a notification about Mary Stevenson's memorial service at 11 today. She and Robert many times came to our Tuesday morning fellowship.
You're talking about
Thank you.
Marion Stevenson.
Yeah, let's repeat that because Dave's audio was not coming through very good. Marion Stevenson's live streaming memorial services at 11 o'clock today off the whatever streaming device you use to hear the services off the church website. That's 11 o'clock today.
Okay.
And if you look at your emails, Dave sent out a copy. In Dave's email, there's a copy of the bulletin that goes with the service.
Right. I saw that.
Okay.
I saw that earlier. I need to say I'm glad I have two other women joining me today. Thank you, Bev, and thank you, Nancy.
You're not alone.
All right.
All right. Why don't we just say a quick little prayer, and then John, are you ready to go?
Ready to go, sir.
Okay. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together. Keep us mindful of the season of your birth. Help us to stay safe and to keep this holiday religious, and help us to feel the camaraderie of this entire group throughout the year. Amen.
Amen.
John, I have one question before you start.
Yes.
Do you need screen sharing?
No.
No.
No, I
Okay.
don't. I'm insufficiently advanced for that.
And are we okay to record your presentation?
Yes, sure thing.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you again, so to speak. I miss the physical gatherings. I miss what I call Presbyterian coffee, too. That was always a good feature of our meeting, but someday, sooner or later. So I'm talking about the Spanish flu of 1918. I'm afraid I have no scientific credentials unless you count elementary physics, 60, 70 years ago, whenever that was. So I rely on sources, and I'd like to give a plug for this book. This is the best book on the flu, still read today, John Barry of The Great Influenza. And there are other books too, but in other words, what I'm about to tell you comes from other people. Well, we'll start with a little factoid. Where did the word influenza come from? And it comes from the Italians, 1400s. They coined it to refer to an illness. It literally means under the influence, you get it, of the stars, which it doesn't help clinically, but that's where it comes from. As we know, influenza is a disease that's been around probably since the dawn of humanity, but only recently identified, characterized, and begun to be treatable. It's a respiratory system disease, directly attacks the lungs, and causes death when it causes death by pneumonia or oxygen starvation. But many people recover from influenza, no matter what its mutation or variation. As a pandemic, we have several historical records. First one is in 1580, which was a bad one, Asia, Europe, maybe the Americas. Several in the late 17th century, two big ones in the 18th century, two more big ones in the 19th century. And then in the 20th and 21st centuries, we've had them, of course, periodically. Asian flu of 1957. I had that. I'm sure I'm not the only one. Another flu in 68, the Hong Kong flu in 99, down to the H1N1 of 2009. So obviously influenza is something we live with, and it's something that breaks out into a particularly virulent phase from time to time. And sometimes, as in 1918, and again in 2020, it becomes especially dangerous, circles the globe and causes millions and millions of deaths. So why is it, I'll do a series of questions here to get into the topic. Why is it called Spanish flu? It must have originated in Spain, right? Well, no, it has nothing to do with Spain. It came to be called the Spanish flu because it broke out in 1918 when World War I is still in its last year, but still very much going on. And surrounding countries involved in the war censored their newspapers. And so although they had the Spanish flu, they didn't allow it to be printed about, didn't allow it to be talked about. It was a secret. But Spain was a neutral. So the Spanish newspapers wrote stories about the Spanish flu from here to kingdom come, and they could not be stopped. So it came, for that rather silly reason, came to be called the Spanish flu, because the Spanish talked about it. The Spanish themselves were not too pleased with the title. They preferred to refer to it as the Portuguese flu. And I suppose the Portuguese had another title. And somebody else called it the Naples a soldier. And I don't know why that was the case either. But the Spanish flu is stuck. So if it didn't come from Spain, where did it come from? There are three candidates. One is us, the US of A. And here it has a lot to do with World War I and something to do with a place you probably never heard of. We should have asked this question geographically half hour ago. It originated under this hypothesis in Haskell County, Kansas, which is in the southwestern part of Kansas, where a few farm boys picked up the disease, and was probably recorded by the local doctor. I'm not sure about that, but flus broke out all over the country, you know, and sometimes they were recorded, sometimes not. Usually they did not travel. Under normal circumstances, this one wouldn't have traveled either. But these farm boys were being inducted into the Army, probably drafted. And so they traveled 200 or 300 yards, 200 or 300 miles across Kansas to a large military installation called Camp Funston, which then housed 55,000, mostly young men, in very cramped conditions, cramped barracks, cramped tents, ideal for spreading the disease. And so there it began to spread at Camp Funston. On March 4th, the first recorded instance of the disease came when a military cook named Albert Gitchell reported on sick call, and with the influenza symptoms. By lunchtime, another 100 had showed up with the same symptoms. Within a week, infections rose to 1,000 and climbing. Well, the Army, military in general, Army and Navy, had been pretty sensitive to the influence of disease starting in the Civil War. As you may or may not know, up until World War I, the majority of military casualties occurred as a result of disease, typhus, dysentery, diarrhea, and not in combat. And so the mission of the Army's Medical Service Corps was to reverse that, get the disease count down. And they were particularly active in World War I and, of course, again in World War II. But in this case, the medical system didn't take alarmist notice of the influenza. They were worried about a lot of diseases. Measles was another big one that was a real threat, including a mortal threat. And besides that, this particular version of the Spanish influenza was relatively mild. It was sometimes called the 3-day disease. It lasted, that is, 3 days under some tellings of it. And though it did create fatalities, they didn't seem to be particularly numerous or particularly alarming. In August of 1918, the disease having spread to Europe, the British Army declared the influenza conquered, it's all gone. I got ahead of myself a bit there. At Camp Funston, the soldiers infected with the disease, not necessarily hospitalized, and got on troop ships or got on trains, headed to embarkation ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, infected the installations on the East Coast where they stayed, infected the troops on board the troop ships, arriving in France, infected the big port, France and Brest, and so on. And from there, the disease spread across to Germany and Italy throughout Europe. Oddly, it wasn't much of a problem once you got into the trenches. No doubt the open air living contributed to that. So that's one hypothesis. We, the Americans, are the culprits, but it's not the only hypothesis. The others I can deal with more quickly. Number 2, China. Wouldn't you have known it? China, or to be more specific, northern China, Manchuria, which exported 200,000 workers, mostly young men, to Western Europe to serve as replacements in industries that had been hit by the war. These 200, something was going on in Manchuria. Maybe it was a pneumonic plague. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was influenza. And the 200,000 Manchurians traveled across the Pacific on crowded ships, disgustingly crowded, across North America on crowded trains, disgustingly crowded, and ended up in Europe where they spread the infection. All we can say to that is maybe. And the third hypothesis is in France, in the Western Front, in the British sector, which, as you stand in France and face Germany, would be up to the north, up in the left-hand side of the front. And there the British sector was quite crowded, more crowded than the much larger French sector, and awash with poisonous chemicals used in the warfare, chlorine, mustard gas, this, that, or the other. It's possible that these chemicals caused the influenza virus to mutate, and so it broke out in an even more virulent form, which we'll come back to. And the fourth hypothesis, not exactly an hypothesis, is none of the above. Same way as saying we'll just never know where it started. You can have whatever hypothesis you like. Let's proceed with questions. How many got sick? Well, numbers, that's a problem. Statistical, we're talking about a pandemic, which in this case is worldwide. Not all pandemics are. And in many countries affected seriously, there's very poor or no record keeping. That would include India, which apparently had a serious infection, China, Russia, in addition to which involved heavily in the war, Germany, normally very good for records, but very distracted by now losing the war. Pretty good records in the US, Britain, France, but again, not perfect, because at first influenza was not a reportable disease. It was equated with the common cold. Doctors didn't report colds, and did not report influenza either for a while. They did report pneumonia, and since influenza often ended up in pneumonia, that's a good indication for us. In the US, probably, well, no, let's do it this way. In the world, hundreds of millions probably got sick. That's the estimate. And in the US, probably 25 million got sick, which is a large chunk of our then population, about 110 million. How many died? That's an even more pertinent question. And again, the same is true. No really reliable statistics. And besides that, as I could have mentioned before, any number of people may have gotten sick and died without getting to a hospital or under medical treatment, so there's no way of knowing. In 1998, two researchers, one Australian, one German, undertook the project to evaluate the number of fatalities in the Spanish flu. They used the best methods, and it came up with answers that are still used today. And this is what you'll hear if you ever hear these again in the media. And their answer for fatalities for Spanish flu was 50 million. Our world population about 1.8 billion. So 50 million is a lot. But they said they had to do so much guesswork, China, India, etc. Then it could have been a good deal higher. It could have been 100 million, and maybe even could have been more. So you're stuck with this answer as well, a very approximate answer, which may understate the case by a lot. In the US, we have pretty reliable figures for fatalities, 675,000. We're closing in on half that number. And I don't predict the future, of course, but I suppose it wouldn't be surprising, vaccine or no vaccine, if we made it again to 600,000 plus. Let's hope not. But today, of course, the US population is about 330 million, almost 3 times what they had in 1918. Well, let's talk a little bit about the incidence of the fatalities. Normally in an influenza, they talked about a W-shaped curve, or W-shaped, not a curve, a W-shaped, a U-shaped chart of a fatalities. A graph would be in the shape of a U with peaks at the upper left and peaks at the upper right. And the peak on the left would consist of young children under the age of 10, among the most vulnerable in a normal influenza. And the peak on the upper right would be our age group of the, dare I say, elderly? No, we'll say senior citizens. We, the very young and the very old, would be the most vulnerable in a normal pandemic. The Spanish flu was different. Its chart was in the form of a W. And the peaks to the left and the right, the very young, the rather old, were less steep than was normal. The peak in the middle that makes the W a W, that was unusual. That was a much younger age group that was so highly vulnerable to the influenza, particularly people in their 20s. It's the soldiers at the Camp Funston and everywhere, and don't forget the sailors on board ships. Indeed, the at-risk group is broader than that. It's usually the most at risk is 20 to 45. My grandmother in that age group came down with the flu and was expected to die. My father, then 10, and his sister, my aunt, also ill and feared for their life. They all did recover. They were fortunate, and my grandfather attributed that to prayer, which of course never hurts. He was himself a Baptist minister. So the W-shaped Spanish flu was unusual, but particularly virulent for all of that. Well, what kind of a disease is the flu? It's the short answer, it's a virus, not a bacteria. And Dave Goodell may want later to correct me or touch up this little paragraph or two a bit, but viruses, as I understand it, well, my author here, John Barry, fudged the question of whether viruses are alive. Bacteria are very much alive, but viruses maybe less so. John Barry, the author, says viruses exist on the edges of life, whatever that means exactly. They don't eat, they don't burn oxygen, they don't reproduce independently, and are very hard to track, 20 times smaller than a bacteria. You could not see them under any optical microscope of the age. And indeed, you couldn't see them until the invention of something called the electron microscope in the 1930s. The Germans did that. So that made the virus particularly hard to deal with. everybody, but I'll come back to this, thought it was a bacteria. And they were, of course, wrong and always on the wrong track. Where does the influenza virus come from? We think it comes from water birds, fowls like ducks, any kind of birds, it turns out, are vulnerable to the influenza, but it doesn't seem to affect them very much. For them, it's not a lung disease. It's a disease of the intestines, and it's spread through the droppings of birds and gets into other animals, perhaps a pig, or perhaps moves directly into the human beings from the bird source. But maybe there's an intermediary, such as a pig or another animal. But overwhelming majority of flu victims get their flu as a result of avian involvement. Medicine and doctors. Let's talk about them some too. In 1918, medicine was at a high point in human history. Medicine had undergone what we can call a medical revolution, another scientific revolution. And historians talk of scientific revolutions starting in the 17th century with physics and astronomy, moving into the 18th century with chemistry, 19th century with biology. Medicine lagged behind all of these leading breakthroughs. Even in the middle of the 19th century, doctors treated you mainly with methods that were out of the 16th century, if not earlier. That means doctors bled patients. They had a theory for that, but they would take a pint or two of blood, including from young children, even infants. Another favored treatment was to introduce powerful laxatives to clean out the system, super powerful laxatives, which of course debilitated the patient. And apart from surgery, which had developed, fortunately, things had not improved very much until the later 1800s, when the germ theory of disease, at first controversial, came to be widely accepted. And it was on the basis of this theory that medical researchers were able to make astonishing advances and to think of themselves as being cutting edge and revolutionary. Starting in the late 1800s and proceeding into the early 1900s, any number of diseases, ancient killers of the human race, became identified, treated, and sometimes vaccinated against. The list is long. Diphtheria, anthrax, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, smallpox, tetanus, typhus, and others. Miracles that these diseases got under control. Speaking of my grandmother, she again had yellow fever sometime in the 20s and was like to die from it. The doctor came too late, it almost seemed, and said immediately, thank God it's malaria. The operative words there are thank God. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have said that. But malaria was treatable with, of course, quinine in the 1920s. So all across Europe, but not yet in America, research institutes developed, scientists collaborated, research went forward at a high clip, and these astonishing discoveries were made. In 1892, a German scientist, Richard Pfeiffer, identified a bacillus that he thought was influenza. And everyone in Europe seemed to agree with him. And it was on that basis that so many researchers went off the track because they were looking for a bacteria causing a Spanish flu, not a virus. Some people even thought that viruses did not exist. As I said, they lived on the edges of life. So what about America? We're going to be top of the line, are we not? Big prospering country in the early 1900s, automobiles we've talked about, railroads, any number of skyscrapers, elevators, radio, any number of other leading advances that made us a top nation, number one in the world. We're right in there pitching, are we not? Well, not so fast. In the 19th century, American medical education, to start there, lagged the world. Surprisingly, here's how it worked. Medical schools, medical school at Harvard, medical school at Penn. Top of the line, wouldn't you think? Not at all. These medical schools, until later in the century, existed as affiliated businesses affiliated with Penn, with Harvard. Think of a typing school that might be affiliated with the university. So Harvard, Penn had no real control over their medical affiliates. So the affiliates benefited from the name, and that was it. Who ran these medical schools? Doctors in the area, in Boston, in Philadelphia. Doctors who were in effect moonlighting. They were making extra money. They set up a one-year program. That's all it was. Offered such courses as they pleased. Courses couldn't be too rigorous because the students paid tuition directly to the faculty member. So if you set up to teach X, you better teach well, and you'd better not be too hard with the grades, so you wouldn't get any students, so you wouldn't get any money. These 2 semesters did not teach very much that we would recognize as medical related. They didn't teach chemistry. They didn't teach biology. They had nothing to do with patient care. The students never touched a patient. They didn't learn to take blood pressure. They didn't learn to take your pulse, etc., etc. So medical education lagged for a long time. Once the president of Harvard asked the fellow who was running that medical school if he, the medical guy, could not improve standards by asking for applying medical students to write longer essays. And the medical man replied, "Why, no, that would be quite impossible. His students couldn't write well enough to write an essay, and certainly not to write a long paper." So that gives you some idea. In America, this changed in the 1890s, rather remarkably. And here we encounter the figure of a person in the news recently, whose name you've heard, Johns Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins was a Quaker, a successful entrepreneur. In 1876, he left most of his fortune, that was $7 million, the largest bequest ever in American philanthropic history, to found a medical school and a medical hospital. Mr. Hopkins has for a long time been venerated as having been a Quaker. His family emancipated their slaves. They lived in Virginia then, and he himself was an ardent abolitionist and a progressive on race all his life. That's now been called into question by some very recent research that I want to go into here. And I don't know, but his reputation will always be firm in the terms of medical research and medical treatments. Hopkins' original inspiration, derived from Europe, was that his medical school, which is what he was founding, would be research-oriented. In other words, it would be unlike schools at Penn, at Harvard, unlike any medical school anywhere in the United States. It would be a research-oriented. It would attract scientists who would research diseases. The hospital would be closely related. Researchers would study the symptoms of patients and try to diagnose diseases right there on the spot, and if possible, treat them. For reasons having to do with finances, the Hopkins Medical School did not get off the ground until the early 1890s. And it would never have amounted to much probably, except that the authorities had the inspiration to hire exactly the right man as its director, its supervisor, its boss, a remarkable fellow named William Welch, who came, I believe, from Connecticut, had gone to Yale, had wanted to be a teacher of Greek at Yale. Somehow that didn't work out. He drifted into medicine, didn't particularly like the medical education he was getting in the US. And so he crossed the Atlantic and went to study in Germany where medical research was booming, as I said earlier. Welch turned out to have a very good scientific mind. He did well in Germany, studied with Robert Koch, one of the KOCH, one of the pioneers of things medical, came to know almost every research scientist in Europe. Indeed, one of his attributes was that he had a heck of a Rolodex, to use that obsolete expression, a supreme networker. He knew everybody. He knew.
John, we've lost your audio. John, can you hear us? John? John, can you hear us? Can you hear me? No.
Maybe you could put a sign up on a piece of paper saying, John, we can't hear you.
That would only help if he's looking at the screen.
Yeah, I know, but it's a chance.
A chance you'll see it.
Hey, John.
John. They see this wave.
Can you see my sign, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not looking.
I'm looking at notes.
I don't even see him. Let
Yeah.
alone the audio. I don't even see him.
Oh,
Yes, he's there.
We see him.
I
Oh,
see
okay.
him.
And we see him talking.
Oh, all right.
But no words are coming out.
Well, he disappeared on my screen.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Here we go. Are we okay now?
Yeah, now we've got you back.
Yeah, now we got you, John.
Now I see.
Okay, where did you lose me? Can anybody remember?
About 3 minutes ago.
Yeah,
Oh,
it was
was I talking about Johns Hopkins?
Johns
Yes,
Hopkins
Yes.
and
yes. You're
Europe,
getting towards the end of Hopkins.
Okay,
Welsh. We're talking about Welsh.
okay. Welsh transformed Johns Hopkins into a leading first-rate medical research institution, and Americans began to emerge as top of the line in these fields, so that the first Americans to win the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine of these three were Hopkins graduates, and the fourth studied somewhere in Europe. Well, let's try to move on, hopefully without any further interruptions. I don't know what happened there. Prevention and treatment. We'll start with doctors. There were plenty of medical professionals in America in the 1918, but many of them were homeopaths, naturopaths, faith healers. If the disease did nothing else, it brought medical science to the medically trained doctors to the top of the profession. The problem in 1918 was that so many doctors and nurses had been commissioned into the army, and so they were off in Europe or on troop ships heading somewhere else. The Medical Service Corps, or the public health authorities, created a volunteer medical service corps, which consisted of retired physicians, and sent them across the country to deal with the disease as best they could. Some were more effective than others. The shortcoming was they had very little to offer by way of treatment. There's no vaccine. We'll get back to that. The miracle drug of the 19th and early 20th century was aspirin. It was shown to be effective in this and that, and people prescribed it with abandon. Doctors threw aspirin at the disease, probably prescribing it in toxic quantities, potentially toxic quantities, and that probably didn't help. Quinine was another miracle drug, which I mentioned earlier, but there's no evidence it works at all. Then doctors just innovated. They did their own thing. They mixed up concoctions, some based on arsenic, Epsom salts, camphor oil, whatever came to mind. In some cases, they recommended alcohol and smoking cigarettes. And don't necessarily knock this. There's a famous architect, Le Corbusier, who got the disease. He retreated to his apartment and drank nothing but brandy for 10 days and did nothing but smoke cigarettes. He recovered. Make of that what you will. Some even went back to bloodletting. But the short of it is there was really nothing that doctors could do in 1918 except recommend lots of fluids, bed rest, and a supervision, if possible, by a nurse. That brings us to nurses. Nurses had also grown in professional status. There are probably 100,000 what they called graduate nurses in America in 1918, but many of them were recruited by the military, and so not nearly enough left to accommodate the whole country. We resorted to volunteer nurses, retired nurses, as opposed to trained nurses. You just did your best with what you could. But nurses were more helpful than doctors because they really could treat you, make you comfortable in bed, bring you fluids. And then thirdly, methods that'll be rather familiar called a social distancing, a phrase known even then. And that means exactly what you would think it means. Separating people one from another, creating a distance, closing schools, theaters, bars, places of worship, curtailing public worship, quarantining at the ports and the points of entry. People encouraged to wash their hands, yes, cover their noses when they sneezed. Masks didn't come into vogue, but still the idea was there. In Philadelphia, this must have been a problem. There were signs went up for residents not to spit in the streets. In Paris, in the 60s, you used to see those signs around all the time, défense de crochet. I never asked, maybe it dates from 1918, not sure. So bed rest and good nursing, that was the best you could hope for. What about vaccines? Well, of course, none was really produced because, well, yes, vaccines were produced, but there were no effective vaccines because it's a virus, not a bacteria. But the doctors produced vaccines at home, homemade vaccines, and it actually injected people, which probably did no good whatsoever. So when we get this vaccine, we'll be well ahead of the game. Let's go back to the virus itself. I said earlier it broke out in spring of 1918, and then it died off. And in the summer, you could have thought you were over it. And then it came back with a vengeance in late August and throughout the fall. That was by far the worst of it. And this is where civilians in America had the hardest time. It spread from seaports, but spread all over the country, from Boston out to the West Coast, up to the north, in the Midwest, down in the South, everywhere you could imagine, and particularly began to affect the military, the Army, more than ever. This is when William Welch got involved. He was down south with some colleagues inspecting military camps when he got an urgent telegram from Washington for he and his team to repair to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, to investigate what we know now to be Spanish flu. When they got there, which was in short order, the trains were efficient. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno, from hell itself. The Fort Devens Hospital was built for 1,200 patients. It was treating maybe 6,000. Young men were lying around everywhere on floors in the closets, mostly not being treated. Doctors, nurses overtaken, many of them had fallen victim to. Care was almost impossible. Welch was taken to the autopsy room, to the morgue, where bodies were stacked up like firewood, and the lungs recovered from the dead oozed a suspicious bloody fluid. Nobody knew what to make of it. Now, among other things, Welch was a great mentor. He never made any scientific discoveries of his own, but he was able to help you with your work. He could suggest this or that, to try this. Have you thought of that? And that's one of the reasons they revered him so much. So when Welch, got there, tensions eased. The grand old man would surely know what to do. For the first time in his life, Welch was completely stumped. He seemed to turn pale. He looked shaken. All he could stammer out, and this was not what you wanted to hear, he said, "This is something new. This is a new infection. We haven't seen this before." He left Devens, made 3 calls to Washington to get teams rolling around the country to work on the problem. Then he himself went home to Baltimore. He had had Spanish flu himself. He put himself to bed and stayed there. He recovered. He died sometime in the 1920s. And this is when the flu hit the American Army with particularly virulence. The Army rose to 4 million. 2 million went to France. But the worst was on board troop ships, which were like Dante's Inferno out of Fort Devens. But the military situation will just have to take care of itself. I'm coming to the end of my talk. Let's conclude with Philadelphia. Philadelphia had the worst experience of any American city. For reasons that are not clear, the influenza does what it does. Population of Philadelphia was 1.75 million, substantially larger than today. An industrial town with dozens of industries and many new ones with regard to the war. Overcrowded, houses impossible to find if you were moving into work. Boarding rooms, boarding houses filled up. You might find yourself sharing a room if you were there to work. You might even share beds. People would work like as in a Navy system, 8 hours for one boarder, 8 hours for another, and so on. So ideally positioned, as it were, to come down with a serious flu epidemic. In September, when things started, the Philadelphia authorities were strangely optimistic. They thought they would miss it altogether, despite the fact that in the Philadelphia Naval Yard, they already had 606 soldiers. And at nearby Fort Meade and nearby Fort Dix, they had other centers of infection. The worst thing happened on September 28th in Philadelphia. There was a big parade for what we would call a war bond drive. They called them Liberty Loans. Of course, the parade, like our Thanksgiving parade, should have been canceled. This was a particularly big one. It stretched out for 2 miles. Hundreds of thousands gathered in the streets to cheer them on. And so a week later, the influenza came to Philadelphia with a vengeance. 600 cases reported in the first day of this new surge, and rose rising into the many hundreds, then into the thousands, with hospital facilities already stripped of professionals because of the war, completely unable to cope. The hospital system just caved in. Volunteers rallied to the cause. And police officers served as makeshift ambulance drivers. Taxi drivers pitched in. Student nurses came to work. Medical students, not yet with their degrees, came to work. Catholic nuns reported en masse, and so on. The greatest need, as it turned out, was for morticians and grave diggers, and they had to be recruited from among the general population too. Overall, in Philadelphia, 17,000 died, which was even higher per capita than in New York City, and many others became disabled and grievously ill. The graves had to be taken care of with steam shovels and the mass graves. I wonder that mass graves must be somewhere in or outside of Philadelphia today. I wonder if they could ever be located. But the flu passed. In 1919, it still existed, but it was diminishing rapidly. In fact, the Philadelphia flu was mainly an October affair. And so things got better, but not gone by themselves. And that happened all over the country and indeed all over the world, that the flu just kind of, having done its excessive damage, went away. I have a few concluding remarks, a few epilogues, matters by way of epilogue. Woodrow Wilson, you remember him, a good Presbyterian, president at Princeton, though they're now trying to disavow him, or have disavowed him, president of the United States. Woodrow Wilson went into the World War with great reluctance. He was a pacifist. People should give him credit for that. And when it became obligatory for the American country to enter the war, Wilson turned his attention to crafting a future peace, a peace that he hoped would last for all time and make war irrelevant and obsolete. In pursuit of that objective, Wilson himself traveled to Paris, where the big peace conference, a summit conference, took place in the spring of 1918. His presence alone gave the conference enormous prestige. He was cheered all over Europe as a savior, and it went to his head. Wilson had the Spanish flu. Not a terribly serious case, but enough to be debilitating. It's thought that he made a number of bad decisions at the Paris Peace Conference, and he was the most powerful man in the world. So when he wanted, he could get his way. And the Spanish flu may be to blame for these bad decisions, and some of which could plausibly be said to have contributed to the coming of World War II. But that's by the way. The epilogue mainly consists of the effort to find out what the disease was all about, even if it is gone. In France, at the Pasteur Institute, some researchers post-war began to suggest that the influenza was caused by that mysterious thing, a virus. But their research methods were not very good, this being wartime. They didn't have what they needed. And so that suggestion was rather dismissed as beyond the pale. Then in America, two research physicians at Columbia after the war produced a more thorough study and argued much more persuasively that the virus was a virus and not a flu. Welch himself endorsed this view, but even so, there were many skeptics. There wasn't proof positive until 1931. An American virologist, Richard Shope, nailed it. The pathogen was a virus. It had nothing to do with a bacillus, nothing to do with Pfeiffer's bacillus. So the French had been right. And before them, there was an American, Paul Lewis, who had made the same suggestion. Park and Williams in New York had been right. The naysayers, the nonconformists, had been right all along. Vaccines were developed in the 30s, particularly in Russia, as is true today. I'm not sure if we know whether they worked or not, but in 1944, US troops heading for Europe indeed got vaccinated for the flu. One of the people working on the flu was a man whose name is familiar. That would be Jonas Salk, later to be involved, of course, with the polio vaccine. When I first heard of Americans who were skeptical of measles, mumps, pneumonia vaccines, the first thing that came to my mind was polio and the great relief with which we greeted the Salk vaccine. I kind of grew up with polio, as you must have too. We had a bit of it in Atlanta. It was always a great concern. Still, the virus had been proved, but had not yet seen. It wasn't until that electron microscope invented in the 30s that Germans invented, and not until 1943 that somebody saw the flu virus for the very first time. So that brings us to a conclusion. The Spanish flu is still remembered as the worst influenza of all time. Let's hope that it continues to enjoy that designation and that we don't improve on it this time around. So thank you for the attention. Sorry about the technical problems. Any questions? Be happy to take them.
I got a question, John.
Okay.
How long did it actually last in the United States?
Well, I'd have to estimate certainly from, I think you could say from January 1, 1918, on the theory that the Kansas farm boys weren't the first to get it. Probably, I would just say until June 1, 1919, or June 30th, 1919. You probably had little flare-ups even after that, but certainly that time frame would encapsulate the bulk of the damage.
So it didn't have as many waves as we think COVID will, or we really can't tell?
We just think of it as two waves. The
Yeah.
wave of spring 18 and then the wave of summer, fall 18,
And it-
spilling over into 19.
And when you talk about it going away, are we talking about there was enough herd immunity that had developed over
Probably,
that time period?
probably.
So we can't really take any lessons or parallels with today's COVID in terms of how long it might last, or we think the vaccine will finally put it to sleep.
Yeah, I couldn't help you there. Dave Goodell might like to give a guesstimate, but that would be above my pay grade.
Okay.
Hey, John, I was interested in hearing the name Jonas Salk because my only knowledge of Salk was with the one of the polio situations in 1952. I had contracted bulbar polio. I was in an iron lung and it really affected my
my
respiratory system, my nervous system, my swallowing, and so forth. And that was before both the Salk and the Sabin vaccines came out. So I was interested to hear you talk about Jonas Salk back in the 1940s.
Thank you. Yes, he's a hero of mine too. Well, in Atlanta, I don't know if it's the warmer weather or not, we seem to have quite a bit of polio. And if you didn't know somebody in your high school who had it, you probably knew somebody who knew somebody who had the polio.
I had been down to Florida in that summer, and it's suspected that that's where I contracted the polio. That was in 1952.
Yeah, could well be. My brother got it, but he apparently had a mild case, thank God, and recovered. And of course, in Georgia and Atlanta, we're not far from Warren Springs, Franklin Roosevelt's summer cottage and home, where he retreated to have his polio treated. And you can see his wheelchair there, at least you could in the 50s when we visited a couple of times. My mother, remember talking about Franklin Roosevelt and polio, and we knew that he walked with braces, as you'll remember, Wayne. And my mother talked about it as though whenever he wanted to walk, he just stepped on his braces, and walked about like you and me. And only much later that I found out, those braces are awfully painful and very hard to maneuver with, and you don't really walk, you kind of lurch from side to side. Roosevelt had a lot of courage, physical and otherwise.
The type of poliomyelitis I had was bulbar. It did not affect my limbs. It affected the respiratory system and
yes,
the swallowing and so forth. So
I remember the iron lungs. Well,
yeah,
God bless you for getting out of it.
I tell people I had polio, and they say, "Well, you walk normally and so forth and so on." I said, "That wasn't that type of polio."
How long were you in the iron lung?
I don't know. I was only 8 years old, and I remember being in the iron lung. Could not move because of the nature of the rubber elastic sleeve around your neck. and just facing upwards all the time. You're lying flat on your back inside the
Oh,
iron
God.
lung. And I just remember it being difficult to sleep because the light in the ward, this was at the old Philadelphia Hospital for Contagious Disease, which was down in Front and Luzerne streets at that time. And the only thing I could recall was that one night while I was asleep, apparently I was taken out of the iron lung and moved to an adjacent ward and put in a regular bed. And that's where I woke up, not in the iron lung, but in a bed. And from what my mother told me when she came in to visit that day and saw that the iron lung in which I had been residing was empty, she thought I had died.
Oh, my God.
She was very upset. And then they said, no, he's breathing on his own in an adjacent room. And so from there, it was just a matter of a lot of rehabilitation and so forth.
Okay.
Don, there's a professor at Westchester University, Bob Kodosky. This summer, he went into the archives at the Historical Society and checked out newspaper articles from those days. And apparently, Westchester and a few of the other towns in Chester County did shut down everything for 3 weeks in October 1918. And then, whatever, the flu passed, or they got herd immunity. And that was really the only economic blip, was those 3 weeks in October.
Uh-huh.
And I guess there was no need to shut down for months and months and months like there
Well,
is
yeah, that's
today.
interesting. Well, they did much better than Philadelphia.
Nick, we're approaching 11 o'clock for those that would like to
Right, go to the funeral.
watch Marion's memorial service.
Sure.
Yeah, so feel free to get off.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you.
With the stink about Dr. Joe Biden, can we call you Dr. John Hurt?
You don't need to, no. I kind of agree with the idea that only medical doctors should use the doctor. At Yale, I guess this is still true. Professors don't refer to themselves, or did not refer to themselves as doctor. They preferred Mr. And I tried that a little bit when I started teaching at Delaware. But, one guy, you can't change the system. So without meaning any disrespect to Dr. Jill Biden, I don't think it's inappropriate to suggest that mere PhDs should carry the title around unless somebody confuse you with a person who could save your life.
Yeah, I thought she was an MD, I wasn't aware of it. Oh, well. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank all of you.
Very good, John.
Okay. See you next
Right.
time.
Well, for finished, this is our last session before the new year. So don't tune in next Tuesday. And
Everyone have a wonderful Christmas. Stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next session.
yeah, and Dave, Walter, what's the date of the next meeting?
January 5th,
January 5th.
Okay.
Do we know who's speaking then?
Don Lincoln.
John is going to talk. Okay. We don't know his subject though, right?
No, and Craig and I have been working diligently to come up with a list of the 21 speakers for next year, and we'll probably be posting those to everybody in the next few weeks. We got a pretty good lineup, everything from sports to history to spiritual issues, and it's going to be another great semester.
Good.
That'd be
Well,
great.
in a way of wishing everybody happy holidays, let me just say, have a cool Yule and a crazy first.
And stay safe.
Yes.
Great. Everybody have a wonderful holiday. Take care. See you in the new year. Bye-bye.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.